I might cover up some of those.
Right, hello everyone. So today I'm coming back with something a bit different as always, and this time we've got a special discussion. So I'm, very happy to welcome you all to my good mate, the First World War historian Taff Gillingham. So I've known Taff for this is going to sound quite surprising now, Taff, but over a decade now, give
Is
or
that
take.
right?
It's got to be,
Blimey.
yeah, yeah. So I was working for the CBA on the Home for a Legacy project at the time, and I remember
Yes, of
dropping you a
course.
message, about the Great War huts, and yeah, that was
Yes.
probably about 10 years ago, which is quite a surprise. So I just want to say, in the decade I've known Taff, he's been an absolute gent and been, really supportive of the work I've been doing and others as well, and absolutely fantastic. Wonderful person. So I'll just quickly hand over to you, Taff, if you want to do a little introduction to yourself.
Yes. Well, as Chris says, Taff Gillingham. I'm a military historian and historical advisor for film, television, and theatre. That's literally paid my wages since I suppose, the late 1990s now.
Wow.
Um, Specialising really in the First World War, but pretty much covering uh, British and Commonwealth uniforms, equipment, weapons, props, historical advice. That's what we do company-wise. That's Khaki Devil. I suppose, specialism as a company, we pretty much cover everything from the Boer War um, till the end of national service as far as
Ah,
historical advice goes. But if you want to hire stuff from us, I mean, that pretty much goes right up to the present day. But
fantastic.
it, the era sort of Boer War till the end of national service, um, that really goes back to I ran the Khaki Chums. The Chums weren't a reenactment group. The Chums were a group of authors, collectors, historians, experts in all sorts of aspects of British military history. And for 30 years, we'd go to France, Belgium, Holland, whatever, wearing uniforms, carrying the gear of soldiers of the two world wars, not for public display, but literally for a specific. Oh, hold on, thank you. Literally for us to learn. That was the whole point. It wasn't about doing it for anybody else. It was for us to learn about the gear, learn about how it was worn, why it was worn, and that over time then led to people saying, well, what did soldiers do? How did they carry things? What do they do? And as certainly the First World War generation were disappearing, there was a gap. There was an opening there for someone who'd experienced a lot of this stuff firsthand, how they wore the stuff, how they carried it. We'd spoken to a lot of First War veterans and obviously and Second War veterans as well. So with a level of authority, you could say, well, this is what they would do in that
Yeah,
circumstance, which led to the whole career as a historical advisor.
amazing.
And that period that the Khaki Chums covered, which was the Boer War to the end of national service, people often used to say, well, that's an odd era. But in reality, in 1899, there were British soldiers in khaki uniforms firing 303 bullets from Lee Enfield rifles.
Yeah,
By 1959, there were still just British soldiers, khaki uniforms, 303 bullets, and Lee Enfield rifles. And in
amazing.
the meantime, there's been two catastrophic wars, and the nuclear age has arrived. But what you
Yeah,
can do as a period of uniforms and equipment, you can literally pick it up and study it from end to end, see how the gear evolved, why it evolved, what worked, what didn't work. So it's a fascinating period. Before the 1899 era, it's very different. After 1960, it's very different. But that sort of
yeah.
pretty much 1900 to 1960, literally, you can see the evolution of pretty much all the gear.
Fantastic. That's absolutely so. Essentially, what you were doing was experimental archaeology, weren't you?
Yeah.
You were taking first-hand primary sources from eyewitnesses and manuals and things, and you were putting that into practice to see how it works
Yeah.
practically.
Yeah.
Which is something we do on a day-to-day basis in archaeology. That's
I,
absolutely
I mean,
fantastic.
it was a fascinating thing because literally the manuals will say, well, the stuff needs to be worn like this, but you
Yeah,
look at the photographs and very clearly it wasn't. And it's only when you put it on, you go, oh, this makes perfect sense because you can't reach it or it doesn't
yeah,
work there, or it's in the way when you sit down. And then you just speak to the veterans and they'd say, oh, yeah, we never wore that there, or we threw that away for this, that, or
yeah,
the other reason. And I mean, obviously, there's been some fantastic work done, oral history research over the years, but generally speaking, it tends to have been about the situation, the battles, things like that. Whereas
yeah.
when we were interviewing them, it was like, well, what did you carry in this pocket? How did you carry that? How much toilet paper did you got? It was the everyday stuff,
Amazing.
which was fascinating. And then in more recent times, we've set up Great War Huts, as you mentioned earlier, which is a First World War museum. really to try and get under the skin of the First World War. There's probably nowhere else really where you can go that does nothing but the First World War. And obviously there's caveats to that, because if we do an exhibition on army underwear, that might well be World War to the present day. But generally, it's about trying to give people a different view of it. It's trying to sort of say, well, it isn't a case of what I think is right and what you think is wrong, but actually, have you ever thought about it like that? And that people go away having a very, very different view of the First World War, not because we've told them a load of old nonsense, but just because we've given them all the bits that they need to actually make up their own mind and go away with a much better view. And that's really working. It really
Wonderful.
is.
Yeah, and just to kind of corroborate that, so as someone who's been, who's attended the Great War Huts do annual, monthly talks throughout the year, open events and all this stuff, and well worth checking out. I'll put links to your website and social media in the I always say comments, not the comment section, the bit below the video, which I can't remember the name of. Please, if anyone's watching, please do check that out. So one of the reasons that I brought Taff on board was so we can discuss one of these. A statement that relates somewhat to the regular and territorial army, kind of tangentially, but mainly the Home Guard. And this is something that I see pop up more and more often these days online, in particular. And this is a statement that, along the lines of, the Home Guard would have been very effective as they were full of First World War veterans. And I saw this posted a couple of months back, and I saw Taff pop up and say that's not the case. I think it was on the Great War Huts Facebook page, and I saw you say that, and I was like, oh, that's quite interesting, because it's not something I'd looked into, and I thought, right, let's get Taff on to have a discussion about this statement that the First World War veterans would have all gone to the Home Guard, which made the Home Guard much more effective. So, how do you want to address this then, Taff? What can you provide us?
I mean, I think that right at the outset, I think the answer is that it certainly did provide a really, really useful framework. The fact that you could recruit so many fellas who just knew the basics of soldiering, how to form a squad, how to drill, how to march around, how to understand orders. All of those things will have made a big difference. There's no doubt about it. But it was 25 years earlier, and people get rusty. People, I mean, even before the First World War, the British Expeditionary Force of 1914, in peacetime, the army in Britain ran at about half strength, just over half strength. So when the war broke out, the numbers were made up of reservists. And those were reservists were fellas who, because of the way you could enroll in the army at the time, in the years leading up to the First World War, you could sign up for 12 years straight or 21 years straight. But most people joined up for a limited number of years with the army and so many on the reserve. So you get 3 with the army, 9 on the reserve, 9 with the army, 3 on the reserve, 7 and 5, 5 and 7. So what that meant in practice was that in the August of 1914, when all of these fellas come back and rejoin the colours, a huge number of them hadn't done a day's soldiering in 9 years.
Right.
So suddenly, within a week or so, they're reissued with a lot of kit they've never seen before, because it's different to the stuff they wore last time. And they're then shipped off to France to face the German army. And, they certainly do an incredible job. There's no doubt the BEF do well, but an awful lot of them can't cope. A lot of them can't cope with the retreat from Monza, sort of marching an enormous distance down the road. A lot of them are out of practice with musketry, because a lot of them have literally never held a short magazine Lee Enfield before, because when they left the army in 1905, their battalion was still equipped with the old long Lee Enfields and things like that. So there was it's by no means the case that you can just leave 25 years and then suddenly go, oh yeah, it's just like getting back on my bike and riding it again. It's going to take time to pick a lot of that up. And whilst, plenty of them will have just dropped back into it, it certainly wasn't going to be something that was that easy. And obviously, 6.7 million men and women had joined the armed forces during the First World War. 700,000 of them had been killed. That still leaves an awful lot of people who'd served in the First World War who came home. But bearing in mind, probably nearly 700,000 of them had been in the Royal Navy, which gives you experience of drilling and marching around and knowing what it's like to serve in a unit, but it doesn't give you any battlefield combat experience as a rifleman. Likewise, an enormous chunk of the army were sort of served behind the lines.
Yeah.
They were the logistic tail of the unit in the field. And so they were, again, the logistic side of it, service corps fellas,
Yeah.
ordnance corps, pioneers,
Pioneers. Yeah.
labor battalions, all of that stuff, who again had never really ever trained properly. They'd done the basics of musketry. They could fire rounds on the range, but they certainly weren't equipped to stop the Nazi hordes in 1940. So all of those fellas had got a sort of a basic skill. In the same way that in 1914, Kitchener's army, there was a lot of fellas who'd been in the Church Lads Brigade or the Boys Brigade, who in those days all drilled with rifles. So you came into it with a small amount of knowledge, which was very useful, but it was still going to need a lot more than that to bring them up to any kind of strength. And then, obviously, the way that the Home Guard recruited, you could be 17 to 65, I think it was in 1940. So what that meant was, in practice, that you could have been born in 1875. In that case, you would have been 90 in 1914. You would already have been 39 years old. You knew 40. First World War breaks out.
Yeah.
So there's an awful lot of fellas who clearly would have just who were knocking on a bit, who would have been eligible. But the fellas who were a bit younger were still eligible to serve in the Second World War. So a lot of those fellas get called back up again. Some of them serve in home service battalions. Some of them go off into fighting units if they're still young enough and fit enough.
Yeah.
But the majority of those fellas find themselves again doing logistic work, doing their drivers, their instructors, people who can release fit, healthy 18 to 25-year-olds to go off and fight Germans. So so they provide a useful job, but obviously they're not around to be in the Home Guard. Anybody who was born from certainly 1901 onwards were too young to have served in the First World War, because by the end it gets much tighter. By 1915, the National Registration Act means that when conscription was introduced in 1916, they know how old people are, so it stops all the underage lads joining. So by 1918, it's pretty rigid. You're 19, in 1918, they lower the age limit to serve overseas to 18 instead of 19. But then in practice, they try to keep you at home until you're 18 and a half, until you're properly ready to go.
Yeah.
But that means, if you're born in 1901 onwards, then you've missed the First World War. So there's an enormous chunk of fellas who've missed the war, who are certainly of the right age to then join the Home Guard if they're in reserved occupations, whatever. And then obviously you get to the stage from I think 1926 onwards. That's when the guys who are going to be 18 in 1939, right up to, I don't know, whatever it is at the end there. 1921, and then to 1926, fellas who are 18 in 1944. So that's when they're going to get called up and go off into the services. And 17-year-olds can join the Home Guard originally. They then lower it to 16. So there's a big chunk of those youngsters as well. And when you and obviously there's a lot of reserved occupations. My grandfather, my uncle were both post office engineers, and my grandfather had served in the Suffolk Regiment in the First World War in Palestine, later in France. But by 1939, 1940, he was a post office telephone engineer, and the job he was doing was much more important than going back in the army. So there was a lot of those fellas. So overall, I suspect that there was really more than about a third of the fellas who served in the Home Guard. I suspect that was the average overall, who were First World War veterans. There was a lot of turnover certainly of the youngsters. There was fellas who'd be falling off at the top end as they reached the older age limit, which I suspect became more rigid as time went on, as it became more effective and more efficient. So it's not to demean the First World War soldiers who joined the Home Guard. Certainly not my grandfather and plenty others served, but the whole idea that it was almost entirely a First World War army that could just have picked up where they left off 25 years earlier, and gone straight back into it. That's not the case at all. It was always going to take time. They would have had a useful role to play. In 1940, it had been pinpricks. There'd have been an irritation to the Germans. They might have slowed down. I suspect by 1944 they were much more useful and would have been a proper force to be reckoned with.
Yeah. That absolutely. So you've pretty much covered everything I wanted to cover there. So I think we can
Sorry.
go, mate. No, no, you're okay. But you've made some really good points there, which I hadn't personally considered, which have, just completely I've just not thought of. And that's the key points of not everyone served in the army. Like I say, there was the Navy and the other forces, but also all those who served in the army weren't in frontline fighting duty, were they?
Yeah,
Like you say,
yeah.
I can't remember what the statistic is, but it's something like for every soldier, there's five behind the lines or
Yeah,
something.
actually, that's probably likely. I mean, obviously, there was an enormous requirement for
Mm,
infantry, but at any one time,
yeah,
there would have been probably five doing the job behind the lines to keep the fellas in the line. I think that's probably true, 5 to 6 of them,
something like that.
because
Yeah,
it was, just I mean, if you, even just to provide the food alone, just to
yeah,
get the stuff offloaded, get it across the channel, and of course, also there was a huge number of fellas who never left Britain,
yeah,
who hadn't joined the army, who were going to be very useful for training, for home defence, for stuff like that,
yeah,
who just
yeah,
never ever reached the level of physical fitness. They never reached A1 standard. So, we need fellas at home, and they spent their entire war in Britain. So of that
yeah,
6.7 million, there's a big chunk of those. So again, they even if they were trained infantrymen, they never put that into practice.
yeah.
Uh, they saw as much combat as the Home Guard did in the Second World War. So, and also going back to fellas in other roles, Alison Hine has written a brilliant book called Refilling Haig's Armies, I think it's called, because
Ah,
there was a misconception, obviously, always sort of propagated over the years, that in 1918, one of the reasons that the Germans crashed through so easily in the
yeah.
March offensive was that Lloyd George had withheld men back in Britain because he didn't want Haig wasting them, which
Ah, okay.
is nonsense. But Alison Hine literally disproves it. She demonstrates that Lloyd George was desperate for men to go to France, knowing that the British Army needed the manpower,
Yeah, yeah,
but there were competing needs. There's a limited supply of manpower, and the Army needs some. The
yeah,
Royal Navy needs some, because nobody ever mentions the Royal Navy, but the job that the Navy did in terms of blockading the Channel and all the
yeah,
other stuff probably did more to defeat the Germans than the Army did on the battlefield, although it's less glamorous work.
yeah,
There were also the men in munitions, because everyone says, "Oh, well, it's the women ran all the munitions factories." Well, they didn't. There was an enormous amount of men
mm,
in munitions factories. The women certainly bulked out the workforce.
yeah,
Um, and when people say, "Oh, well, the men all came back in 1918 and got their jobs back, and the women had to leave," but the reality was that most of the jobs that the women had taken on were jobs that didn't exist before the war, as the
ah,
munitions and clothing and boots and everything else expanded enormously in wartime. They
yeah,
needed to take on people to make all that stuff.
yeah,
So most of that expansion was stuff that didn't exist before the war, and needless to say, then after the war, nobody wanted to buy army boots again, because there was millions of them around. So it
yeah,
shrunk back to its pre-war state, but there were still an awful lot of men doing roles that were heavy lifting or
yeah,
specialists spent years training for.
yeah,
And also the mines. And again,
yeah,
nobody thinks about coal mines, but there were huge numbers of fellas who went down the mines. There'd been a massive problem in
mm,
1914 with miners leaving the mines to join the army, not surprisingly, because at
yeah,
least you got some fresh air. But by 1918, yeah, you're not going to have your factories doing anything if you haven't got fellas, digging the coal out of the ground. So
yeah,
those main competing needs of army, navy, munitions, well, not just munitions, but factories in general, and coal,
yeah,
um, all had competing demands on the manpower. And all of those people were all, again, potential recruits for the Home Guard, again, of which, a big chunk of them had seen no service whatsoever, no active service. So,
yeah.
there's all of those things that come into play. And there'll be fellas who decided that they'd had enough of wearing khaki and firing rifles, and went off and joined the ARP or something like that,
Yeah,
and specifically chose not to.
yeah, no, that's absolutely fantastic. So yeah, I think one of the key issues with this statement is that people are making it obviously just see as if that makes a lot of sense. I shall repeat this, and then when you look into the actual practical statistics of it, it's this idea that not everyone that joined the army in the First World War actually went to fight or got sent to
Yeah,
fight, isn't it? And like I
yeah,
say, a very small selection of those actually did. So I think that's the key issue, really, isn't it? The other thing I was going to draw attention to as well was, like you said, about the reserves. So
yes,
obviously during the Second World War, you also mentioned the Home Service battalions, the Home Defence
Yeah,
battalions. And one of the things I want to do in the future is a little video looking at what we term the old soldiers battalions, who were
yes,
aged from
yeah,
40 to 55, I think it was,
yes,
who would
yeah,
fall within perfectly that age bracket,
yeah,
but they would have
yeah,
been deployed in the UK,
yeah,
doing
yeah,
things which are traditionally now and erroneously seen as a home guard duty, like airfield defence,
yeah, yeah,
running messages and all this stuff. And
yeah.
yeah, that was the key point I wanted to make, is that the ones who were still on the either in the reserves would have been put into the home defence battalions or
Yeah,
signed up for the home defence
yeah,
battalions,
yeah,
in a full-time role rather
yeah,
than joining the home guard.
yeah,
And
yeah.
also make the point that those soldiers would be much more useful in a full-time role rather than the part-time role that the home guard would do. Yeah,
Yeah, well,
no,
exactly that. I mean, that's the other thing, isn't it?
yeah,
That there was a that because at least by having them full time, you could
yeah,
bring them back up to speed again. You could actually make them useful, but with the understanding and the full in the knowledge that they were never going to be ideal frontline soldiers. They were just too old and unfit. You can have a sprinkling of that because Kitchener's battalions in the First World War clearly demonstrated that just because you're in your 50s didn't mean that you would make a good infantry soldier,
yeah.
but you certainly needed that sort of leavening of 19 to 28, 30 year olds to do all
Yeah,
the running around.
yeah, yeah. What you can have, all the soldiers on static duties, which are perfect for airfield defence,
Yeah,
nodal
yeah,
point defence,
yeah,
in some cases factory defence, but that was
yeah,
primarily a home guard, thing.
yeah,
But it,
yeah.
what I like about putting the home guard into context is it frees up the professional full-time soldiers to do stuff that they didn't really need to be doing, like
I mean, that's
defending,
true. Yeah,
defending
yeah,
factories, defending the road and communications network, so the
yeah,
post
yeah,
office telephone exchange.
yeah.
When you see the home guard in the wider picture, their role is vitally important to doing a role that wasn't needed of
Yeah.
full-time soldiers. Yeah.
And what's interesting, I recently picked up during the First World War, the
Mm.
First World Guard had started off the Volunteer Training Corps.
Yeah.
In 1916, they'd become the Volunteer Regiment. So this time, instead of
Ah.
the VTC, which were outside War Office control because Kitchener had no interest in them whatsoever, had
Yeah.
nothing to do with them. After Kitchener's death, then they become sort of under the umbrella of the War Office, although they still weren't allowed to
Ah.
have proper khaki uniforms. It was, yeah, you're part of the gang, but at a distance. Um, and and they were affiliated to Lord Lieutenancy. So if you had a V
Oh.
Suffolk shoulder title, that meant that you were under Suffolk Lord Lieutenant. So you would also see V Rutland and things like that, which obviously wasn't a county per se. Um, but over the weekend, I managed to get hold of a bound volume of the magazines which were produced by
Mm.
the 4th Battalion, the Suffolk Volunteer Regiment, which were based at Woodbridge, the sort of Woodbridge and surrounding area. And there was a cracking piece in one of those where they were really chuffed that I think it was 58th London Division, who were stationed in Suffolk for a time in 1916, had asked them specifically to provide 6 men to guard Wilford Bridge on the outskirts of Melton,
Yeah.
to free up manpower, but there's an entire infantry division here.
Yeah.
But we haven't got 6 men to spare just to stand at the side of the road and guard a bridge. But actually, could you fellas do that for us? And
Yeah.
they were so chuffed that they'd been asked to do this. Like, oh, that's proper soldiering. But it's the same thing. It's
Yeah.
exactly that.
Yeah.
58 Londons want to go and do training. They don't want to waste time standing around in the cold,
Yeah.
guarding a bridge that's unlikely to get attacked. So the guys who volunteered to do this work are doing it for them,
Yeah.
and pattern just repeated 25 years later.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that often goes overstated is when the home I can't think of a way of putting this in better words, but that was almost a sentence. When the home guard would be called upon, I think today there's this perception that the home guard were full time doing everything, all the
Yeah,
time. And when you look at the war diaries and the various standing orders, it's very clear that obviously the home guard in a lot, or the home members of the home guard had jobs to be doing during the day, so they
yeah,
wouldn't be called
yeah,
upon to like defend an aircraft or
yeah,
stick up a roadblock before the balloon went up. And
yeah,
I think
yeah,
this idea today is that the home guard were permanently doing everything 24 hours a day, when in reality
yeah,
they would only under certain circumstances be called up to do an exercise, or
yeah,
would be drilling once a week or something.
yeah,
But in most circumstances they would only be called up in the event of an invasion taking place
yeah,
and under the authority of the local battalion or division commander or
yeah.
something like that.
I mean, my granddad's left. My granddad kept a diary all the way through the war.
Oh,
The
wow.
only surviving one's 1941, but that's very
Yeah,
clear. You know, what the
yeah,
nights that they do home guard training, and then when they go off on camp, and the stuff that they do, and where they go, and who they go
yeah.
with. Also, quite recently, I was very lucky to be given all the paperwork of one of the company commanders of the 9th Suffolk Home Guard, who later then transfers and becomes the company commander of the 11th. And
Oh,
what was fascinating in that was just how many exercises throughout the year that they actually had. Some
yeah,
of them were national exercises, some were just local ones, some were just between a couple, but how all of the local battalions worked together. So in Ipswich,
yeah,
you've got the 6th, the 9th, the 11th, who were Suffolk Home Guard. You've got the motor transport units who were part of it. The auxiliaries get a bit of a mention, I think, in one bit, but
yeah.
but not too much because they don't
It's
really
it's
exist.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
very broad, isn't it? When they make, I've
yeah,
seen
yeah,
two mentions of the
yeah,
auxiliaries, and it's literally
yeah.
just they exist.
And my grandfather and uncle being post office home guard, they were 35 GPO home guard was the 13th Essex, but because they were 13th Essex because the post office headquarters was in Colchester.
Ah,
But B Company were based in Ipswich, which is what they were, and they get a mention as well. So obviously, all of those units take part in these exercises. They all have their specific roles to play, and
yeah,
there are mentions of things like in the event of an invasion, Corporal so and so and these three men will go into the railway tunnel at Ipswich, and they're going to block it with wedges so that trains would come off the track and all that. And then there's
yeah,
the head of the station master or whatever, saying, actually, on no account will your fellas go and even attempt to do this. You know, that work will be done by my men if it needs doing, and they can stand and watch. You know, because it's like, I'm not having you derailing any trains by accident.
yeah,
But the level of detail, you know, the stuff that they were going to do.
yeah,
Yes, they've got a day job, but those specifics, that the little tiny bits that everybody was going to need to do
yeah,
in the event of an invasion, the minute the Germans get at such and such point, then we're going to block the railway, we're going to destroy this bridge, we're going to do all of these things.
yeah,
All of that stuff had been practiced, trained for, planned out.
yeah,
Had the time come, then no doubt at all that they would have gone ahead and done it. I mean, and again, the whole
yeah,
thing, oh, the Home Guard never had any ammunition. Well, the Home Guard as a unit had plenty of ammunition.
yeah,
The idea that you give it to, vast quantities to fellas who were going to just go and stand their rifle in the broom cupboard at home
yeah,
with all the potential dangers of that. I mean, in the First World War, they'd learnt the lesson that soldiers have to take their rifles home because it's been cited to them, and what do you do with it when they've gone
of
on leave?
course.
So they have to
Yes.
take it with them. But
Yeah.
to begin with, they'd let them take the ammunition as well. And of course, there's fellas coming home, settling scores and getting drunk and all sorts of stuff and
Yeah.
shooting people.
As
So
you
they,
do,
right, well, no, yeah. Eventually, right, okay, well, you take your rifle, but your ammunition will stay behind, which is sensible. But
Yeah.
of course, that's very different. If you've only been formed for home defence,
Yeah.
then you need some ammunition if the balloon goes up, even if it's only 5 rounds until
Yeah.
more can be brought to you,
Yeah.
then you're going to need some ammunition. But that is not to say that the
Yeah.
unit itself didn't have several thousand rounds ready for issue
Yeah.
when the time came. So again, I
Yeah.
think the whole the idea that they didn't have any at all, I think, is or hardly any, I think, is a
Yeah.
misnomer.
Yeah. Again, absolutely fantastic points there in terms of ammunition. So I just want to, one of the things that I've come across as well is this ensuring security of munitions. So there
Yeah,
was a key fear of fifth column activity. So if you can have your ammunition in kind of like one or two dispersed places that can be guarded
yes,
full time, it makes it
yeah,
easier to protect it and
yeah,
distribute it. And
yeah,
the key thing as well that, like you say, the Home Guard weren't going to be blatting away trying to suppress the enemy, were they? They were just literally going
exactly.
to, they would. If you think about a section of 8 men as well, 5 rounds each is going to be
Yeah,
enough for you to
yeah,
break
yeah,
contact,
yeah,
you know, get
yeah,
withdraw and pass on the information where you've come
yeah,
against the enemy, rather than standing there and fighting it out and trying to
yeah,
suppress an incoming force. I think that's
yeah.
a
I
really
mean, I
cool.
mean, I mean, as time goes on, I suspect by 1944 they were capable
Mm.
of operating as a standard infantry battalion,
Oh yeah, yeah,
you know,
undoubtedly.
and fight a proper, a proper full pitched battle. But
Yeah,
in 1940, their job was just to be chucked under the wheels of the German war machine, try and trip it up. That was the role.
yeah, and
Uh,
also pass on information up the chain of command.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so delay, pass on
yeah,
information, keep the lines of communication open.
yeah,
And
yeah,
yeah,
very much.
like you were saying about 944, we start to see. like towards the end of 41 where the and throughout 1941 where the military are clearly assessing Home Guard units for their
Yeah.
I don't know, not efficiency is not the word, but their suitability to a more frontline role. And
Usefulness. I mean,
usefulness, that's the word. Yeah, that's it.
usefulness to the army.
Yeah, and there was an exercise in early 41, which I've been looking at in Thetford, and what they were clearly doing is testing these local Home Guard units in towns and stuff to see whether they were capable
Yeah.
of undertaking not only the tasks that had been allotted in 1940, but additional tasks such as
Yeah.
more mobile warfare, or whether
Yeah.
the units were better suited
Yeah.
to static warfare, for example. So they
Yeah.
were clearly assessing these units on a one-by-one basis, and
Yeah.
like I say, by 44, I have no doubt that the Home Guard were not, we're not, I've got no doubt that the Home Guard were not sorry, I can't, I'm tripping myself up. No doubt that the Home Guard were extremely professional, extremely capable by that point, but it had taken years of organization,
Yeah.
reorganization, and
And,
training.
and you can't just take fellas
Mm,
one night a week and a couple of
yeah,
and a couple of times a year on camp to bring them to that standard. The whole
yeah,
reason that Kitchener and Lord Roberts detested the territorial force
mm,
before the First World War was that they thought there's no possible way that you can bring soldiers up to any sort of fighting standard because
mm,
the territorials had exactly the same thing. They'd meet up once a
right,
week, they'd go to
yeah,
camp once a year, sometimes twice a year.
twice a
And
year,
the
yeah,
idea that you could then pitch them into a fight against an enemy nation and do any good with
mm,
them was
yeah,
considered laughable.
yeah,
And certainly some of those units that were sent to France too early. I mean, 4th Suffolks were a classic example. In the November of
mm,
1914, they're detached from their territorial brigade in Britain. They're sent to France because they're just desperate for manpower.
yeah,
They're attached to the Jalunda Brigade in the Lahore Division, the Indian Corps, and frankly, they have a terrible war. That at no
right,
point do they ever really get up to the standard that they needed to because they were sent too early. They'd had
yeah,
no time to get up to a proper standard. Because you weren't obliged to serve overseas as a territorial, it
mm,
meant that a lot of fellas had joined the army when the war broke out who were prepared to go. So
yeah.
you end up going in the November of 1914, almost half the battalion were people who'd only joined in the last couple of months. And they
Wow.
suddenly find themselves in France with
Yeah.
rifles that, literally, and they've only fired. I mean, it's laughable. And they
Yeah.
never, ever get on top of that. Some units do, but the
Mm,
Suffolks, I think probably the attack at High Wood in 1916, they don't do too badly, but
yeah.
virtually every other time, they just don't do very well. And that's because they were sent too early. They'd never
Yeah.
had the training before the war. They were commanded by people who'd run engineering works or were
Yeah.
solicitors or
Yeah.
bank managers who were lovely people, I'm sure, but they never, ever quite got to that level. And
Yeah.
at least with the Home Guard, you'd got fellas who'd in command who'd very often the platoon commanders were people who'd been sergeants or company sergeant
Mm,
majors,
yeah.
military medal winners, DCM winners. These were people who commanded the respect of people in combat who'd reached a level of something that the others could aspire to.
Yeah.
And then at the
Yeah.
more senior levels were the fellows who'd probably been the platoon commanders during the First World War. So you'd got that. There was something about them that the fellas in the First World War hadn't got.
Yeah.
But there's a direct relation, I think, between the two, between the territorials of the First World War and the Home Guard of the Second.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that you were talking about the army assessing the Home Guard, because the same thing had happened with the volunteer regiments in 1918, because they
Right.
hadn't really been. They're still, these are the amateurs, they just do one day a week. But by late 1918, literally only a few weeks before the end of the war, bearing in mind nobody knew the war was going to come to an end
Yeah.
at that time, they are then allowed to wear their local regiment cap badge, which was a big
Mm,
deal for a lot of them.
yeah. Yeah.
Secondly, they were allowed to go on attachment with things like coastal defence batteries to make up the numbers there to free manpower.
Yeah.
So as long as your boss was happy, then and would sign you off. And I've got some lovely paperwork of a fella. It was a farm labourer, and the farmer had said, "Yeah, you go on, boy, you're going to have a good time." And he'd gone off to somewhere or other and joined a coastal battery and had a whale of a time for the last few weeks of the war. So
Oh, wow.
the same thing, we reached a point where actually these have been amateurs, but actually they've been at it long enough. They must have reached some standard by now.
Yeah.
Actually, they're more than capable
Yeah.
of making up the numbers and doing something really useful, not just partially useful.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. Those parallels between the First and Second World War, I think, are something
Yeah,
that needs to be used as a way of better informing what
yeah,
we know about the Second World War, and
yeah.
that's some
And
absolutely
I
fantastic.
think that people often miss that. I think that people
Mm,
often treat them as such completely different animals.
yeah,
But 25 years is nothing, you know,
yeah,
in military terms. It's all of those lessons were still in the heads of people who were still young enough
yeah,
to remember them and apply them.
yeah,
And they knew what hadn't worked. They knew what had worked. And I think that I think that one of the reasons why the Home Guard proved so popular is that there had been something
mm,
similar first time round, you know, so you
yeah,
couldn't argue as Kitchener and Roberts had done it, you know, the territorial force and the volunteer training corps are useless and a waste of everyone's time and energy
yeah,
because they proved themselves.
yeah,
The territorials had proved themselves on the battlefield, the volunteer training corps and the volunteer regiments had proved themselves in home defence.
yeah,
So 25 years later, well, we've established that this can work.
yeah,
Now let's just put it into practice. Now let's just recruit people and make it work.
yeah,
So I think I think that really did um, give them a firmer grounding that they'd had first time round. When really, I mean, home defence you'd had the militia and the volunteers going
yeah,
back to the Napoleonic era, but to have kicked it up a level to actually have proper, you know, properly formed, organised, regular, in the way that it turned out, I think was definitely something that was different.
yeah. Absolutely fantastic. Right. No, that's brilliant. So Zoom is telling me I've got a minute left. So I think if we draw it
Actually,
to a
just
close. Oh, yeah,
really
yeah,
quickly, I think it's worth saying the other thing that people often do when they talk about the Home Guard is they assume that the Home Guard would be the only ones doing any defending. The idea that
yes,
suddenly the regular army have disappeared
yeah.
and the Home Guard are going to be left on their
Gone on
own,
a
like, oh
holiday
no,
for a
the
few
army is
years.
gone. Yeah,
Yeah,
so I think that's another important thing to
that
remember.
is,
I mean,
yeah.
a cog in a much bigger machine.
Exactly that. Yeah, exactly that. Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Taff. Very
That's a
much
pleasure.
appreciate this.
Always a
Let us know
pleasure.
if you want to come back on as well. If there's any more myths
Yeah,
as well you'd
yeah,
like to have a chat about, just
yeah,
let us
yeah,
know.
yeah.
And yeah, I just want to thank you so much. Hopefully, I'll get to see some more talks this year at Great Wars. But as an
You're
aside, I've
very
started.
welcome.
Oh, fantastic! The problem is I've got to be in the office on a Thursday now, and in Northampton, so I've got to set off early.
Ah,
But
yes, it's
I'm going to
tricky.
make sure that I jig my days around a bit, just so I can make that. But thank you
Excellent.
once again, Taff.
My
I'll
pleasure.
stop recording here and cheers. I'll put all the links in the thing below. Right.
Thank you.